And the second scripture comes from the book of John. Jesus cleanses the temple. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple with the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews then said, "This temple's been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But it was speaking of the temple of his body. The word of the Lord. Years ago, one of my favorite things, I was teaching Girl Scouts. And I was teaching brownies, and we had a troop that was small, about 12 kids, but one child in our troop, she was emotionally and physically challenged, and she'd been born prematurely at 1 pound. I mean 1 pound. And she had issues relating to that premature birth. When the other girls were easily earning badges, this child struggled with even putting basic concepts together. She couldn't stay focused. She didn't understand direction. She had a difficult time with mobility. And it became apparent to us as leaders at that time there really weren't any special allowances or curriculum in Scouts for kids with disabilities. Now, Girl Scouts was supposed to be all-inclusive, but if you couldn't really read the badge work or physically do the work, there wasn't any alternative curriculum. Then there was the teasing. When we went to regional group events, a bunch of regional events, once a year, twice a year, this child was often teased and left out purposely by the other troops. Now, our troop kids were amazing. They stood by this child. They helped her whenever they could. They even found a way to help her run down a field, like a 3-legged race, to earn a badge. And if anyone criticized or made fun of her in their presence, they became like mother lions protecting their cubs. They were determined to make sure that Girl Scouts was a safe place for all kids. And they became angry when they couldn't make that happen. Jesus at the temple. The temple in Jerusalem was the size, prepared for this, of 12 soccer fields put together end to end. It was ginormous. There were several courts, as we can see here. The inner court, the inner holy court, was only for the high priests, where all the holy activities took place. Not often. And then outside of the holy court was the court of the regular priests, and then the court of Israel, and then the court of women, and finally the court of the Gentiles, who were allowed to come and worship in this outer court. This was also the place where the vendors set up shops. Amy Jo Levine, known as AJ, the scholar whose curriculum we're using for our Lenten study, states that the temple was so many things to the Jews. It was a symbol like our Statue of Liberty, a place of national recognition, a house of prayer, a site for the 3 festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. It was a national bank and the only place in the Jewish world where sacrifices to God could be offered. This is why there were vendors on site. They were selling animals for sacrifice. Many of the travelers could not bring animals with them because it was too far to travel with animals, and the animals could get injured on the way or become blemished on the way, so they needed to buy them on site. Our expectations, says Amy, are that the temple in Jerusalem was like our church, or a very large church. There was a place for children to learn, a place for adults to learn, a sanctuary where the Jews worshiped. We need to get these images and ideals out of our head. How many of you have been to Europe and visited cathedrals? Oh my, right? Like, how many do you visit? Like, lots and lots and lots, right? Besides being lovely, they are tourist attractions. I mean, they're tourist attractions, correct? They are. There are sometimes guards at the front door. Ralph and I encountered a guard at the front door. There are stations to offer donations. There are guides that bring you through and share what the cathedral's like. It's sometimes a tourist destination. In Jerusalem, The festivals brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to the temple yearly. The temple was a big tourist attraction, and the vendors were part of that. And during Passover, there was this jubilant feeling in the air because they were celebrating the Feast of Freedom. Everyone was very happy. It was loud, it was crowded, much like a football stadium, and maybe even a bit like a vacation setting. You're seeing friends and relatives you might not have seen for a long time since the last festival you were required to attend. It was a happy time. Let's look at a picture of what the vendor areas might have looked like. Kind of busy, isn't it? Now, the vendors would have been set up alongside the pillars, and they used the areas like stalls like you'd see in a flea market. And now, Jesus, when he turned over the tables and yelled and brought out the whip, I want you to imagine, it might have been in one corner of the 12 soccer fields, end to end. So if 2 tables were overturned in one corner, a ruckus was on that end. But at the other end of the 12 soccer fields, would they have heard? No. They wouldn't even notice. People nearby noticed, but business went along as usual. So I want you to imagine how big it was. So his disruption was disruptive, but in a very small area of the temple. But they did have something like a temple police, and they noticed. They really noticed. And so it was very, very, very risky for Jesus to get upset in this way in the temple. He was taking a risk. Now, we often have a lot of questions about Jesus and his anger, and we wonder what drove him to this kind of anger. Remember our expectations about Palm Sunday and the crowds all waving palms, yet only one gospel account of 4 were palms ever mentioned. This is also true with the temple. Every gospel account is slightly different in reference to Jesus making a ruckus in the temple. And there's no evidence that the vendors are overcharging or exploiting the population. But Hollywood has promoted that. So that's kind of what's in our head. Jesus is not engaging in a protest of cheating the poor. He's not. And we know from further study that he's not angry about the money lenders. We'll discuss the money changers at another time, but not the money lenders. He was also not upset about the sacrifices being offered or vendors perhaps overcharging visitors, like we go to the airport to get a bottle of water and how much does it cost, right? There's no evidence to support that. We also know that Jesus loved the temple and he did not reject it. He's angry for another reason, but there's so much anger. In some gospel accounts, Jesus appears violent. In fact, using a whip against the tables might be considered violent. However, we might think of Jesus' actions in the temple in terms of righteous anger, or as AJ calls it, holy anger. Holy anger. When businesses or practices are not using just inappropriate methods, but obscene methods, something must be done. Years ago, I took my girls shopping for new clothes for school. And we went by several stores, in the mall that promoted trendy clothing, and we got a couple little outfits. And then we went to a national chain looking for underwear, because the kids had grown out of their underwear. They were a year older, and so we needed new sizes. In a national chain, you will never believe it, when we walked into the girls' underwear department, they actually had on display thong satin bikini underwear for 9-year-olds. For 9-year-olds, seriously. Clothing is not meant to be sexual for children at all, ever. We don't sexualize our young girls. It just isn't right. And when I see thong underwear for 9-year-olds, it fills me with righteous anger. So the question remains, if Jesus wasn't mad about the money lenders and wasn't mad about mischarging customers for the sacrificial animals or anything, what was he angry about? What made him so angry? Let's listen to the same passage in the book of Mark this time. One section. Is it not written that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? This comes directly from Isaiah 56, 6 through 7. In the book of Luke and Matthew, My house shall be called a house of prayer. In the book of John we read today, take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. We've heard many things that could have made Jesus angry. What one thing had him filled with righteous anger, holy anger? Friends, he was standing up for all the Gentiles in the room, you and me. He was not concerned about the temple itself or the faith behind it, but the attitude of those entering in. The Jews entering in and setting up shop. This one section of the temple was designated for non-Jews. They weren't allowed anywhere else, and this was the place designated for prayer for Gentiles. The Gentiles who came to this part of the temple courts might have believed in Yahweh, but knew they weren't part of the tribe. They were supposed to be welcomed, yet they were set apart. They didn't follow Moses out of Egypt, and they were not part of the covenant. The men weren't circumcised, yet some believed in God. They might have heard of God, or they practiced some type of faith. The space was supposed to be reserved for them, a quiet, reflective space. And Jesus knew that this one small part of the temple could give them hope. Jesus knew that many Gentiles who were saved by faith went there to pray, a safe place of comfort. The promise God made to Abraham before Israel was even formed, that promise? This area of the temple was specifically designated for that promise, but the people had forgotten. Genesis 22:15-18. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the skies and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of all the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Jesus saw what his brothers and sisters had done by defiling this safe zone for the Gentiles. They cared nothing for the Abrahamic promise, the promise God made to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, not just the nation of Israel. It was being destroyed by money-hungry bigots, is what he thought. Mark 11:17. As he taught them, he said, Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers? This statement comes directly from two of their own prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah. All nations, not just yours. Jesus was wholly angry, righteously angry. His very own people who studied these same sacred writings which foretold about God, including the Gentiles too, they were forgetting. When businesses or practices are not using just appropriate methods, but obscene methods instead, something must be done. Jesus got angry. He flipped tables. He was passionate about including all nations in his family, not just the Jews who believed. And not one time in the Bible does Jesus get mad at a Gentile who reached out to him. His anger was focused toward the establishment and his brothers as a group. When the little girl in our troop lost her safe place, when we're at regional activities that were supposed to be inclusive, a place where she felt accepted and loved, the other troop members became mama lions and protected her. This is what Jesus did. A house for all, not just for some. From A.J. Levine. The routine nature of our everyday lives sometimes seems ludicrous in the face of suffering around the world. But taking a moment inside the scene where Jesus is overturning tables in this house of prayer for all nations can offer us a way to see what we actually might do to reassess our own actions and make our own corner of the world, our temples, a more welcoming place for all people. It's okay. Arnie will get it. I'm just going to ask you some wondering questions. Let's think about some wondering questions. And I have quite a few after reading about this. When does anger become problematic and sinful instead of righteous? It's a good question, right? When is it appropriate to disrupt someone else's comfort because of our own anger? How can we turn our righteous anger into righteous action? Those were wondering questions for ourselves. Now let's look at a wondering question for our church. What are the challenges we face in protecting the very ones God has set aside space for? What are the challenges our church faces in welcoming people who are not already insiders? Is there a place for them? Have we reserved a place for them in this room and in our hearts? Are we already praying for the people that are supposed to be here? Are we taking the time to pray to say, God, we know who you want in this building. We know who you want to call here. Let's pray for those people. And how could our church welcome people a little bit more fully? It's a good question, one we need to ponder, I think. Remember the Front Porch Project. Are they going to come in the doors? And if not, how do we meet them where they are? Overturning Tables by John Vandelar. Truth be told, Jesus, there might be a few tables that need overturning in our lives. Beneath the veneer of respectability, the tidy rows and neat regulations can hide dark addictions and angry judgments, hungry greeds and heartless rejections. We know the pain, and so do those around us, of keeping up the facade. Oh, what a relief it would be to have it all upset, smashed, scattered, and destroyed. So perhaps, Jesus, today you could pay us a visit and help us to radically rearrange the furniture of our lives. Amen.